Hello, I'm Exhibitions Coordinator Austin Strutt, and I would like to welcome you to the Dundas Museum and Archive's newest exhibit, I Spy Dundas, where we invite you to take a closer look at the artifacts that tell our town's history. Behind the camera is our Education Coordinator, Anna Patterson. Thank you, Anna. And together, we're gonna give you a little tour of the artifacts we have on display and the activities that you can do as you go along in this exhibit. So, to start off with, I'll say some words about the exhibit itself. Here at the museum, we know better than anyone, I suppose, how important the little details of an artifact can be to telling the history of our town. The smallest maker's mark on the piece of a china or a name scrawled on someone's tool can reveal an incredible amount of history that helps to bring the past of our community to life. The idea of this exhibit is to encourage visitors to come in and take a look at those small ideas, or small details through I Spy games that they can play as they go through. So each display in this room deals with a different aspect of our collection, and each display has an I Spy riddle that goes along. And we hope that you'll come in and give it a shot to see if you can find all the small details in each display. So every artifact in this room comes from the enormous collection of the Dundas Museum and Archives, a collection with over 16,000 artifacts and even more archival documents that date back to the beginning of the Dundas Historical Society in 1942. When the Dundas Historical Society started, it was just a group of concerned and interested citizens who were worried that the history of the town might not be preserved if people didn't start actively collecting. They were headed by Mr. H. Graham Bertram, who was part of the wealthy Bertram family of local industrialists. As soon as they started collecting, they found that people in town had an amazing wealth of artifacts in their houses. People still had land deeds dating back to the early settler period, old tools, their grandparents' Victorian clothing, and a lot of that came here to the museum where it could start to be preserved. Now actually, there was no museum yet in the 1940s. It was in 1956 that the Historical Society, using money from the Bertram Foundation and an apple orchard donated by the Peary family, decided to put together the Dundas Historical Society Museum, now known as the Dundas Museum and Archives. These skates here are the very first items accepted into the collection. They bear the number 1942-1, which is an accession number we use to track the artifacts. That means that they were the first artifact that came in 1942. They belonged to Mr. Andrew Graham, who owned a grocery store here in Dundas in the 1860s. And he used the skates to skate on the frozen water of the old Desjardins Canal. At the bottom of this case, we have the latest artifact to be accepted into the collection. So this is a small porcelain rabbit, a piggy bank, but a rabbit, a bunny bank, that was given out as a prize for the Dundas JC's annual Easter egg hunt in 1979. It was made by McMaster Pottery, who are a very prolific local pottery firm. So the first display here deals with photography. We are incredibly proud and passionate about our photograph collection here at the Dundas Museum and Archives. As old as the collection itself, we've been collecting photographs, often from the photographers themselves or from family albums, which help to tell the story of Dundas. So this display is just a small fraction of the photographs in the collection. I would encourage when you come in to take a closer look at some of these fascinating pictures. For instance, this little one here, where my finger is an image of the Moss Bakery back in the 1800s. So the Moss family had a bakery in Dundas, which was on the north side of King Street, roughly opposite to where Piconi's is now. And their building burned in the 1880s, and they moved to the building that is in Piconi's today. Piconi's took over from the Moss Bakery in 1915. Some larger images here. Right above the bakery is a portrait of R.S. Brooke. He was a notable Dundas photographer. And next to him is the seal for his photography studio that would appear on the back of each of his photographs. Over here is a great shot of Haley's Hotel, which was what the Central Hotel was named in the 1940s. This is in 1947 as part of the Centennial Parade when Dundas celebrated the 100th anniversary of its incorporation. So the Central Hotel is still there. Pinder's variety store, which was next to it, and toy store, some people in town will remember it lasted into the 70s. And it's notable, you can see there are some American and French flags flying. These were left over from celebrations from the end of World War II, which happened just 2 years before. Some later images here include some great scenes of the old music hall in 1969, which is still there today, and some great shots of people looking at pottery on King Street in Cactus Festival in 1984. You can see the sign for the old deluxe restaurant in there in the back. So photographs are something we're always looking at, still collecting. I mean, history definitely doesn't end with the Second World War, and getting more images of the town that come from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 2000s is a big priority of ours. So if anybody has any photos from their family that they would be willing to donate or bring in so that we can scan, we would absolutely love that. And of course, we would give you back the high quality scans as well as your photo, so long as we can keep a digital copy in our collection for further use. So the next section here relates to art. And Dundas has a fascinating artistic history that goes back to the very beginning of the town. Obviously today there are institutions like the DVSA and Carnegie which really define the community, but the artistic tradition in Dundas is an incredibly old and rich one. This image here is one of my favorites. It dates back to 1853, and it shows the town as it looked just a few years after incorporation, with the town hall centered around a bunch of bustling factories, mills, and production houses. This was executed by Mr. Hardy Gregory, who was a very prolific Dundas painter, lithographer, and map maker who eventually moved to James Street in Hamilton in the 1850s. His scene really shows Dundas at the height of its ambitious era before the need for a deepwater port sort of made the Desjardins Canal obsolete and the railways carried the 20th century steel investment into Hamilton. Below it is a very different kind of view of Dundas, much more picturesque and bucolic. This scene by Julian Ruggles Seavey, who was also a prolific Dundas and Hamilton painter in the latter half of the 19th century, shows the town nestled in the valley as viewed from, as he puts it, the toll gate on the old Greensville Road. So there used to be a toll gate at every mountain access in Hamilton and Dundas because, of course, the government didn't upkeep roads in those days, and so you had to pay a toll to the landowner anytime you wanted to use them. This beautiful watercolor up here is Mrs. Jane Knottman. So Jane was the daughter of William Knottman, who was a notable barrister and politician and militia leader in Dundas, who almost got in a duel with Sir Allan MacNab. This is a beautiful portrait that would date to about 1850, when she was 16 years old. I love this one here. This is the prize certificate that was awarded to Mr. T.A. Bertram of Dundas for winning the Grand Aggregate Shooting Prize at Bisley in 1899. So Bisley was a British Empire target shooting competition, which still continues today, and Dundas often sent delegates as part of the Canadian group to go over there and shoot. And in 1899, Mr. T.A. Bertram, who was a local doctor, won the Grand Aggregate Prize. He was the first person not from Britain to win it, and it was a cause of huge celebration in town. This painting here is one that I love. It was executed by Mr. Dave Mitson in the 1950s. Now, Mr. Mitson was an amateur painter and a lover of local history, and he sort of combined those two hobbies together in a series of canvases that portrayed the town as he remembered it when he was younger, around the turn of the century. So this shows the corner of King and Sydenham, which today is where we have the 4 banks in Dundas, and it's looking at Sydenham, so you're sort of based right where the TD Bank is, looking north. So you can see the old Bank of Hamilton building, which used to be here, and the old Kane and Lance grocery store, which was on the northwest corner, with the doctor's office next to it. And the little doctor's office is now today on the museum property. It was moved in 1974 when those buildings were demolished to build the current Bank of Montreal. Up here is a really beautiful painting by F.B. Bowman. Mr. Bowman was another local doctor, but he was an artist himself this time. He actually created a series of really beautiful homemade Christmas cards that he printed locally and sent out to people that have Dundas and Hamilton landmarks. He did this really nice mid-century sort of view of the town hall with the cannon out front, and he donated it directly to the museum in 1959. So I'll move. Oh, sure. Sure, yeah. If anybody has any questions, please type them in. We'll do our best to answer them. I'd love to get people's thoughts or hear what they're interested in seeing in these displays. So, tableware, china, pewter, and cutlery, this is a huge part of our domestic collection here at the Dundas Museum. In the old days, hosting dinners was a social obligation for any family of good standing. And that meant that objects like these were an important way of demonstrating one's affluence and taste. They really, in some cases, came to define the families who owned them because they would be brought out at special celebrations and dinners in which other people in the town would attend. Some obvious highlights are these three beautiful items at the back. So the red Bohemian frosted glass decanter belonged to the Peary family, whose house is today attached to the museum itself. That blue spritzer, it's hard to see, but there's some fogged glass on the front, which is the eagle logo of the Cummer & Sons Mineral Water Company in Hamilton, who sold a lot of their goods in Dundas. And at the back is one of our favorite items here at the museum. It's a over 100-year-old pickle preserved in a glass with pickling fluid. And what's kind of interesting about this pickle is you can notice it's much too big to remove from the bottle. It was grown inside the bottle and pickled with the intent to preserve it for all time. Some more neat items in here include this little stoneware mug. It's a very old-fashioned mug that has no handle on it, which was part of the style in the old days and would date to about 1850. And it came from the Riley House, which was a notable tavern in Dundas. So it says Riley's Hotel, Dundas CW, of course meaning Canada West, which was the old name for Ontario before Confederation. Out front here are some cute little items that I really like. There are some commemorative china with scenes of Dundas that were done about the turn of the century. So the little creamer has a scene of the old Desjardins Canal turning basin, that's now the Centennial Park, and the plate has some scenes of the old lime kilns, which were used to be visible on the Dundas escarpment just under the peak. Going along with that tableware, we have a bunch of collection of items here that relate to grocery stores. Dundas had tons of grocery stores in the old days, over 30 in the 1860s, and this was because Dundas was a hub for local farmers to get their produce shipped out via the Desjardins Canal. So local grocers would import goods that farmers needed, like gas and oil for their lamps, pharmaceuticals, sodas, things like that, and then they would trade it for the farm goods. So there's some really neat items in here that most of them have provenance connected to specific grocery stores. This big jug here has the name John Vassy. Vassy was one of the biggest shippers in and out of the canal in the old days. This curious item down here, it looks like a beehive. It's a wrought iron string dispenser. And of course, the beehive was a symbol of industry, and it was included on the seal of Dundas. This was part of P&R Lang's store, which was at 15 King Street West, and operated from, I think, the 1880s all the way into the 1930s. You can see here down at the front, another interesting item. It looks like it's a big long auger. It looks sort of like a carpenter's tool, but actually it's a cheese tester. So it would be used to plunge into the core of a giant block of cheese to test the quality all the way into the center. When you come in, our exhibit will challenge people to find a tomato, a spring, a ginger beer bottle, and a tiny gnome in this display. So moving over here is a great image of one of the old Dundas grocery stores. Now this is the same building that appeared in Mr. Mitson's painting that we looked at earlier. It's on the northwest corner of King and Sydenham, where the Bank of Montreal now is. And this was Kane and Lance's grocery store. Kane and Lance was a regular grocer, and they also sold a lot of dry goods and household goods such as china and things. And next to the building is, you can see the doctor's office that I mentioned before that's now on museum property that dates back to the 1840s. The reason these photos can be blown up so big and be seen in such amazing detail is they were taken on extremely large glass negatives. And the benefit of those glass negatives is they are so big in and of themselves that they capture an incredible amount of quality. I mean, when you think about a film being projected on a film screen, it comes from just a tiny little negative that's that big. So just being magnetized even 7, 8, 10 times as big magnifies that quality. So I'll lead you around here. Dundas, as I've kind of alluded to, had a history as an industrial town in its early years. It was known as an industry town. And that came out of the fact that all the creeks made it an ideal place for building mills in the early settler period. Lots of mills popped up on Spencer Creek, on Sydenham Creek, at the top of the waterfalls, and then these mills slowly developed into foundries and factories in the 1900s, and they were fueled then by the fact that the Desjardins Canal carried shipping right into Dundas. And when the canal died, that sort of foundry and factory aspect of Dundas ended. And so Dundas's industrial history is very much a 19th century one. But even then, a few businesses continued on afterward, such as the Bertram factory, which made big machines for other foundries, such as the big steam hammer that we have out front. They built a lot of things for Stelco and Hamilton. And they had a small tools division as well, Pratt and Whitney, whose building is still there on Hat Street. Valley City, too, was a manufacturing company that did beautiful woodwork for a lot of church pews and interiors, and even lab spaces and things for around Canada and the world. And those were operating well up until the 1970s and 80s. This case shows some of the tools that relate to different trades in Dundas's history. Some highlights are this big, beautiful axe, which was made in the Hourigan Axe Works in Dundas, which was on Hat Street. Dates to about the 1850s. And you can see it's interesting. It has this skewed handle that sort of runs up. And that's so that you could walk along a log and slash at it without cutting into your own leg to square out a rounded log. There's some beautiful ribbons over here, too, that are some of my favorites. So Bertram's had a company picnic every year. They would often go to Burlington Beach, and these ribbons were sort of souvenirs. Now, these are fancy ribbons that belong to the employee, or to the employer and the committee members who were invited. The regular ribbons that workers at the factory had were often just pretty plain. This little doorknob, porcelain doorknob, came from Hugh Walker's Hardware. And it's kind of funny, this is one of the only things in our collection that came from Walker's, but a lot of people in town will still remember it. It was a fascinating hardware store on King Street that operated from the 1930s into the 1980s. And actually, it took over from Mr. J. Findlay Smith, who had a hardware store there dating back to the 1860s. So a lot of the stock actually went back to that time period. And people would always say that if you couldn't get it at Walker's, then you couldn't get it anywhere. Now, we kind of like to think of the museum sometimes as a bit of an old attic for Dundas, a place where people can store old things with memories and they can be preserved through time. So this display is sort of like an attic for the whole town of Dundas, and it has some really neat items that tell some history of the town. This trunk, for example, belonged to Mrs. Clara Latshaw. She was the wife of F.A. Latshaw, who was a cabinet maker and undertaker in Dundas. And some of his tools were actually on display in the tool case. This broom was actually a curling broom, and it was used by the Dundas curling team in 1903 to win the Tankard Championship against Hamilton. And on its bamboo handle is inscribed the names of the team members, including people like C. Collins, who owned the Collins Hotel, and Mr. T.A. Bertram, who won the shooting prize that we showed you earlier. Coming down here, there's a really beautiful old-fashioned sled. And this sled probably dates to about 1875. It says Santa Claus on it, and there's a nice running horse. Not running over snow, though. But it was found in the old coach house at Bonington at 50 Creighton Road. And Bonington was the home of Thomas Bain, who was MP for 22 years and eventually a Speaker of the House in Ottawa. He settled in Dundas after his time as Speaker, and this was probably played with by his two daughters, Mary and Helen. The big drum over here was the drum of the 77th Wentworth Regiment Band. And the 77th was Dundas's local militia from the 1870s all the way up until the 1930s when it was amalgamated with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. The badges painted on this drum show both the emblems of the 77th and the 129th Overseas Battalion, which was the battalion that many men from the 77th ended up in during the First World War. I think it's neat to think that maybe the band playing in Mr. Mitson's painting on the other wall, this is the drum that was depicted there. In the back is a beautiful carved Corinthian column. This came from the interior of the Central Hotel. It was part of the original furnishings of that building, which was built by Mr. T.A. Wardell in 1890. It was removed by the Michetician family when they renovated the building in 1969 to turn it into the Golden Valley Inn, which is better known as the Owl's Roost. And I'll bring down to another one of our favorite pieces here, this beautiful rocking horse, covered in real horse fur. It's a pretty opulent toy. It belonged actually to Mr. William Osler, Sir William Osler, the famous medical innovator who would end up co-founding Johns Hopkins Hospital. He actually spent his youth in Dundas, where the Osler family had lived for many years. And he was known as quite a terror as a young boy. Another huge part of our collection that we take a lot of pride in is our textile and clothing collection. And unfortunately, this is a part of our vault that we rarely get to bring out because a lot of the items are very delicate and can't stand prolonged or repeated display. So this display here of sewing and clothing related items is a bit of a stand-in for kind of the breadth and scope of this fantastic aspect of our collection. There's a lot of beautiful sewing items in here, including some curious pieces. This interesting little item there, it's an ivory thread cutter, and it would be worn on the finger of a dressmaker so that she could quickly sever threads while doing hand stitching. These curious implements here as well are button hooks. And button hooks were an essential accessory for any well-dressed Victorian in the day. A lot of Victorian clothes had a lot of little buttons, and you would do them up by putting the button hook through the hole, hooking over the button shank, and pulling it through the hole. I love the one shaped like a snake here, and another one with the name of H. Clark, a shoe store in Dundas. Probably the most notable clothing manufacturer in Dundas was Grafton's. Grafton's had its store and its manufacturing facility here in Dundas and employed many people in the town. This beautiful print here shows a bunch of the employees who worked at Grafton's with their names circa 1900. There's nothing we love here more at the museum than portraits of people with names attached. And if you donate photos, please write the names on the back. In fact, even in your own family albums, please write the names on the back. It means so much. Grafton's was founded in the 1850s as Gregson and Grafton, and by the 1900s they had 7 branches across the province. They snapped up a lot of the smaller local tailors to work for them, and they were famous for the quality of their clothing, which was made out of really nice fabrics that were bought by Colonel Grafton in Scotland and the British Isles each year when he went on a trip. Grafton specialized in men's clothing, but they branched out into some women's clothing too and some odd things as well. This here is a Grafton's baseball uniform for the Grafton's company baseball team. They probably would have played against a Bertram's or a Leonard's baseball team back in the day. These are some examples of some of the clothing from our collection. This dress, which dates to about 1880, is an example of everyday wear for a Dundas woman about that time. It's in beautiful shape and has been really nicely preserved. It was actually a wedding gift for Mrs. Whitby of Dundas. The large quilt at the back there was executed by Marcy Lyons, who is a member of the Lyons family, one of the oldest Loyalist families in Dundas. They came in the 1700s, fleeing America after the American Revolution. This quilt is actually double-sided, and it has a different pattern on each side, and was executed by her in 1847. One aspect of the collection that's great for I Spy is our toy collection. And here are some fascinating highlights from that. The group here includes a youth's chemistry set from 1836, a ticket to the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. It's a child's ticket. Some beautiful toy soldiers here. They're quite large, and they're not made out of tin or plastic. They're made out of a material called composition, which is a kind of sawdust and glue that was packed together. And this was popular during the First World War, when any kinds of tins and metals were needed for war production. And perhaps one of the greatest toys of all in our collection is right around here. So this, as Anna passes by, is the Dawnville House. So the Dawnville House is the most opulent of several doll houses that we have in our collection. It was handmade for Mary Dawnville by her father in 1899, and it's an exact replica of the house they lived in on Park Street in Hamilton. The house was built in 1899, and Mary was very young, and the story goes that she destroyed much of the original furniture that went with it. And the dollhouse was loaned out to other children throughout the 20s and 30s, and when Mary got it back as an adult woman in the 1950s, she decided to fix it back up again and create her own furniture as if the family still lived there. The details in this dollhouse are just fantastic, and I know anyone who comes in will love taking a look through it and seeing if they can spot all the little details we have listed. So to finish off, I'll talk a little bit about donating to the collection. So here at the museum, we're always looking for more items that can help tell the stories of Dundas. But when we decide whether to take in an item or not, we're really interested in the story that it can tell. And we want to prioritize items that, even though they may seem inconsequential, a small everyday item here and there, if it has a story that goes along with it, we're fascinated by it and want to include that in the collection. It's just amazing to see the things that people bring in that help tell the stories of their family members who worked in Dundas, who lived in Dundas, school memories that they've had. Even little photographs that seem inconsequential become amazing time capsules over time and can let us see back. So I thought I'd list off a few of the things here at the museum that we're looking for the most. And so these are our most wanted at the moment. Obviously, we're interested in any items in the collection that help tell the story of our community. But we're very interested in collecting more local art, professional and amateur, records created by or relating to women and minority communities within Dundas, whose stories are definitely underrepresented in our collection, men's clothing from the 19th to early 20th century, which rarely survives, items manufactured in Dundas or relating to Dundas industry, artifacts relating to Dundas Cactus Festival and the Cactus Festival Parade, and objects relating to the 1970s, 80s biker culture in Dundas, which is also very underrepresented. And look at your photographs too in your family collections. Photographs of Dundas from the 1930s to 2000s with people or buildings identified. These would be fantastic because in the next 50 years, that will be the kind of history that we're trying to tell from that era. So we hope that you'll come in and take a look at the exhibit and spend some time trying to look at the little details in these cases and learn about the artifacts themselves. There's so much that can be done. Of course, the museum is always free. It is admission by donation, and we encourage you to come in for a safe visit and to explore some local history. Thank you very much.